Hi, everyone. Welcome to my And God Said podcast. This is Reverend Kimberly Constant, and this podcast is in conjunction with a Bible study I teach called Cover to Cover, in which we study the entire Bible in 9 months. This lecture is going to set the scene for the next book of the Bible that we are reading, and that is the book of Exodus. If you're in my cover to cover study, we're spending a good amount of time in this book, just like we did in the book of Genesis, because together they form pivotal, foundational understanding for the rest of Scripture, for this plan of redemption that God is putting into place, for why things need to be redeemed in the first place. And now we're going to move from the story of one family, the family of Abraham, to the story of a nation, the nation of Israel. So for those in my study, I want to set the scene for you so that as you begin to read Exodus, you can have some things in mind and some background information. For those of you just listening to the podcast, this will just give you a good background and basic information about the book of Exodus. So the author is Moses. He is the main author of all 5 books of what we call the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. But there are significant editorial additions. Sometimes those are very noticeable when we get multiple versions of the same story, for instance. And we're going to talk about that with the book of Exodus because there's quite a bit of repetitive material. Dating, it was put into its final written form somewhere around 1000 BC, the time of the kings. But these are stories that were told sitting around the campfires. And so as Moses was leading the people out of Egypt and into the desert and then on into the promised land, eventually these stories were already taking shape. They were part of the people's collective history, but it took a while to take that oral tradition and put it into written form. We find a lot of genres in the book of Exodus. We've got historiography, we have lots of lists, we have legal codes and the law, and we even have not once, but twice building instructions for how to construct the tabernacle. And the purpose of the book of Exodus is to convey the origins of the nation of Israel. So Genesis taught us so much about the origins of humanity in general, creation, this world that God has made. Then we learned about the origins of the chosen sort of family, if you will, the people that started this plan of redemption where God spoke through Abraham. And now it's going to coalesce into this nation called Israel. And they will be called God's chosen people. And the purpose of Israel is to make God known in a hostile world. They have a missional purpose, and that's really important to understand and to remember. Sometimes I think, well, maybe it's just me, or maybe you would agree with this. Before I really started studying the Bible as a whole, I kind of thought of missional purposes as something from the New Testament, as that commandment of Jesus at the end of the book of Matthew, go and make disciples of all the nations. But God has always had a missional purpose for his people, even back in the Garden of Eden, where he had said to Adam and Eve, it's your job to take care of this creation. Well, now it's going to be this entire nation's job to make God known. They are going to be the vehicle through which God reaches out to the rest of the world. And indeed, it is a hostile world, as we've already seen from what we've learned in the book of Genesis. Some of the themes to look for in Exodus: revelation. God will continue to reveal himself, especially through his relationship with Moses. It's going to be very important to look at. We are going to learn God's name, his personal name for himself, and I will talk more about that in a minute or two, well, not in a minute or two, in a lecture or two when we look at that section of Exodus. But it will come in Exodus 3, verses 14 through 15, so pay attention to that entire story. It's the story of the burning bush. It's a good one, and God's revelation of his name. And I'll explain what his name means, why it's pronounced different ways, all of that good stuff in the next lecture. We're also going to learn about God's glory in Exodus 33 and 34. There's a story where Moses asks to see God's glory, and that's very significant. God reveals much about himself in that passage. Excuse me. And we are also going to see even more of God's grace than we've already seen. Yes, I just love to point out that grace is very present in the Old Testament, and we will see God's grace specifically in the story of the golden calf, which comes around Exodus 32. We're also going to see a big theme in Exodus is leadership. What does it mean to be a leader? What does it mean to be a leader anointed by God? And what does God expect of his leaders? We're going to see the theme of deliverance, God bringing the people out of slavery, out of Egypt, and into Mount Sinai, and then hopefully on to the promised land. That's the goal. We're going to see provision and protection, God providing for his people in the wilderness, forming them together and ensuring their protection from the hostile world in which they live. And we'll continue to see this theme of creation that began in Genesis. Now it's the creation of a nation. So we looked at more individual, the creation of Adam and Eve, of human beings, and what that looked like. And now we're going to look at what it looks like to create a nation for himself. So looking at the structure of Exodus, the first 15 chapters really deal with liberating God's people. And here we see Moses as a precursor to Jesus. I use the work of Sandra Richter a lot in this study. I think I said this before in one of my lectures, but I just want to point it out again that a lot of what I say comes from her books. So check her out, Dr. Sandra Richter. She's amazing. Epic of Eden. So she talks about this thing called type. In biblical study language, we would say Moses is a type. And what does she mean by type? She means either an historical event, something that actually happened, or a person that lived and breathed in history. And there's a specific parallel between two historical entities. So in the Bible, earlier events like the Exodus itself, or persons like Moses, or places like Mount Sinai become patterns by which later events, persons, and places are interpreted. So Moses becomes a type that is going to point us to Jesus. The story of the Exodus itself, this liberation of God's people, is central and crucial to Israel's faith. It is the event to which they will return, to which they point to as symbolic of God's provision and protection and his grace and his ability to save and to deliver them. And this is the event that then leads to them becoming a nation, God's people. So it's crucial to their faith. You will see it all throughout the Old Testament and even into the New Testament. It is to the Old Testament what Jesus' death and resurrection is to the New Testament. It is that significant. But what's interesting is it's just a small portion of Exodus. I mean, it's not small, but it's like the first fourth of the book. And then the rest of the book deals with the formation of God's people. So we kind of get through the events of the Exodus rather quickly in our reading. And then we turn to what's maybe a little bit more dry, although there's some great stories peppered in, but the forming of God's people. And so we're going to get the law, specifically the 10 Commandments and Mosaic law. We're going to talk more about covenant. We're going to see the tabernacle, like I said, not once, but twice. And again, just a note that this is the majority of the book of Exodus. And so many of us know the story of the first part, Moses leading the people out of Egypt. But there's not as much focus on that second part, the 2/3 or 3/4 of the rest of Exodus. So let's situate ourselves in history. We're in datable history now. That began with the story of Abraham. Now we're really going to start to be able to somewhat assign dates and places to what we're reading in the Bible. So if you're able to, I have a PowerPoint that I send out to my class. or if you watch this video, you can see it on the screen right now. So if you're listening, you might want to check it out. It's just a timeline. I got this from Sandra Richter's book as well. So if you had a copy of that book, you could look it up there. But it shows where we are in history. So we had creation, which is undateable. Then we had the patriarchs, which is somewhere around 2000 BC. Joseph and the tribes going to Egypt occurs somewhere between 1800 and 1650. That's a wide-ranging period. And then we have the event of Exodus. And there's debate about these dates. That's why you see 1800, 1650 for Joseph versus 1446, 1250 for the Exodus from Egypt. Why is there discrepancy? Well, let's talk about it. First, I just want to also show this graphic. This is a rough timeline of the events that occur in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books of the Bible. So we have creation, that's prehistory. We have the story of the patriarchs. That takes up a couple of hundreds of years. We see multiple generations of a family. Then Exodus 1 through 3, just that small part of Exodus, covers hundreds of years. And then things slow down. When we get to Exodus 4 all the way to Numbers 10, that is just 1 year in the life of Israel. They are at Mount Sinai for about a year, where God is, they're getting to Sinai, preparing to leave it, getting the law, they mess up, all sorts of stuff happens there at the foot of the mountain. Then we'll see in Numbers, they head into the wilderness, and the rest of Numbers covers about 40 years in the life of Israel. And then Deuteronomy is 1 day, not even a day. It's really a compilation of Moses' best sermons, if you will, his final words to the people. So you can see that we cover tons of ground, and then we slow down a lot at the majority of the book of Exodus. So let's talk about dating. What is the discrepancy? There's more than a couple of options, but I'm going to go over the 2 main ones. So some scholars argue for what's called the early dating. This would be the Exodus happening in the mid-15th century, 1450 BC or so. This seems to line up with some of the dates in the Bible. For instance, in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, they mention that 480 years after Exodus, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, etc. So if you count back from Solomon's reign, that would put Exodus at about 1440 BC. But the Bible is confusing because some of the other dates seem to argue for a different timeline. So for example, in Exodus 12, they say Israel was in Egypt for 430 years. We believe Israel went to Egypt between the 18th century and 1550 BC, and that would make Exodus occurring in the 13th century, so a later date. Numbers in the Bible are super tricky. They are not one-to-one correlations with numbers and dates as we understand them today. The timelines, the lifelines of people, the amount of people, when we look at numbers, they're going to count the people, and it just doesn't, what they count and record doesn't seem to line up with what scholars and archaeologists think how many people came out of Egypt. So numbers are off, super tricky. Most scholars don't favor this earlier date because of that reason, numbers being tricky. We can't really correlate one-to-one. We simply don't know what a lot of the numbers symbolize. A lot of them seem stylized. For instance, 1 Kings saying that it was 480 years after Exodus. Well, 480 is 40 times 12 tribes of Israel. 40 is a significant number in the Bible, so it could be that that's symbolic of something. We don't know. So we have to be really careful when it comes to dates and numbers to hold our interpretations loosely. We're not going to be able to be completely confident because of that tricky correlation. The second option that most scholars seem to favor is a later dating, that the Exodus happened somewhere in the first half of the 13th century, so between 1300 and 1250 BC. Just a note, remember we're in BC, so we're counting backwards. So the lower numbers are later because we're going to 0 and then we're going to start from 0 with the birth of Jesus and go up from there. So a couple of points in favor of this argument. One is the discovery of something called the Merneptah stele. This is an Egyptian monument, and it states that Merneptah subdued several people groups in Canaan, including Israel, in his 5th year, which was around 1209. So for Israel to be in Canaan, for Merneptah to subdue, they would have had to had the Exodus before that. Now, a word about these monuments. This was a big thing in the ancient Near East. Kings and leaders and rulers of different places would say, oh, I wiped out that entire people group, and they would establish a monument to themselves saying that they conquered everyone. It was usually hyperbole. They didn't conquer everybody. Israel continued to survive. It's not significant what he is saying. It's significant that Israel is being mentioned because that shows that they were in Canaan by this time. Also, Exodus chapter 1 verse 11 states that the Israelites built the store cities of Pithom and Ramses, and these are most likely named after Egyptian rulers. Ramses II built the city of Ramses in the mid-13th century. So the Exodus would have had to take place after he ascended to the throne. The Israelites built this city, and then they were led out of Egypt by Moses. So this all points to a later, dating around 1250 BC. Archaeological findings, also a complex picture. Archaeological findings need just as much interpretation as what we read in the Bible. So during the transition from the late Bronze Age, which is about 1550 to 1200, to the Iron Age, which is 1200 to 1000, archaeological evidence shows that there was a surge of pastoral people into the region of Canaan. But they came not as like one giant group that all moved into the same settlement. They were smaller, scattered settlements. Some of this is because of the geography of the land. Some of this is because just that many people, the land wouldn't have been able to support. We saw this in the story of Abraham. Remember, Abraham and his nephew Lot had to separate because the ground couldn't support all the people and animals that they had with them. So they take off in different directions to ensure that they don't consume everything in their sight. Well, the same would have been true for an exodus out of Egypt. So this suggests that Israel's movement into Canaan was a little slower and more gentle than maybe we think when we just read the Bible and kind of take it all very literally. We're going to talk more about this in Joshua, because even the Bible itself supports this, that yes, a big group might have come out of Egypt, but they sort of populate the land of Canaan in smaller settlements and over time. So again, we'll talk more about that in Joshua. There's archaeological evidence of an Israelite settlement at Bethel, built on top of a destroyed Canaanite site, and some other cities and areas within Israel as well. So again, this supports that there was destruction, that the people entered in and did conquer the land, as we're going to talk about in Joshua. So again, just kind of a complex picture. Was it this giant group of people all at once? Was it a slower migration into the land? Let's look at that when we get to the book of Joshua. So in history, historical evidence supports the biblical timeline. What we know from history and from other nations and recordings that we have is that Semitic people migrated to Egypt sometime during that Middle Bronze period. So this would have been Joseph and his people. And by the end of this time, they had acquired influence. This goes along with the story of Joseph. So much so that historical records show that Egypt indeed did begin to oppress this group of people. Many scholars think the Pharaoh that we're going to see in the Exodus story is Ramses II. So, how did they get to Egypt? Let's remember what we read in the end of the book of Genesis, because Exodus piggybacks on this story. So, with Joseph, we saw that his people migrated to Egypt to survive the famine. They were blessed to be provided for because Joseph had earned high standing in the Egyptian government. God had given him favor. This sort of event was very common in the ancient Near East. Famines happened all the time. Egypt at the time of the Joseph story was prosperous. And so if people were experiencing hardship, they would go to Egypt to seek out provision. So this lines up well with what we've read. The region in which Israel settled was called Goshen, and it was in the eastern Nile Delta. And Egypt put them there because they viewed shepherds as loathsome. They were smelly, stinky, lower class to them people. And so they stuck them out sort of in the wilderness where they wouldn't have to really interact with them on a daily basis. At the close of Genesis, if you remember, things were pretty good for the offspring of the patriarchs. They had been provided for, they had land, they had favor, but that would not last. So, some things to note as we start to read through the book of Exodus. Again, I talked about leadership. We want to look at the development spiritually of the leaders of Israel, or the lack thereof, because some of them seem to mature spiritually and some of them not at all. So look especially at Moses, but look at Aaron, his sister Miriam, what happens with Pharaoh, for instance, even though he's not an Israelite. Look at the different leaders and what happens to them. We want to pay attention to this missional purpose of the nation of Israel. What does God say to them about their purpose? And then how does God enable them to fulfill that purpose? What is God going to do to solidify their standing, to give them authority? You're going to see this on a smaller level with Moses and on a nationwide level with Israel itself. We want to look at punishments. This is one of those areas of the Old Testament that gives people pause, and rightly so. It's often difficult to read about the punishments that people experience. They're scary, they're awful, they make us cringe, and it makes some people really feel like they don't want to read the Old Testament, that God is different in the Old Testament than he seems in the New Testament. So we're going to talk about that in this study, and so we want to pay attention. What are the punishments that God hands down, if you will? Does God warn the people about these consequences? Does he say in advance, if you do this, this is going to happen to you? If he does warn them, how much time passes between God's warning and then the actual carrying out of the punishment? Is it right away? He warns them, they mess up right away, and bam, they're smited by lightning? Or is it God warns them and they transgress, God continues to kind of say, get yourself together, and then finally God punishes them? And then we also want to note who is involved in delivering the punishment. Is it God alone? He sends a lightning bolt. Is it Moses acting on God's behalf? Is it all the people of Israel? Who's involved and what are they called to do? And then we can talk about the differences between all of these and sort of compare and contrast them. And when we do this, it won't make it any easier to read. It's not supposed to be easy to read. It's scary. There's some awful things that happen. I wouldn't imagine that would ever feel good to read. But when we start to look at some of these deeper details, it's going to help it make more sense to us. And it's going to kind of take away some of that shock and astonishment. And it'll make sense, and we'll see God's grace in action, his mercy, his protection, all of those things. And maybe it helps a little bit. We also want to note the concept of intercession. This is big with God's leaders, and Moses is going to get the chance to intercede for the people. So I want you to note that exchange with Moses and God, what God says, what Moses does. We're going to talk about that. And then where do you find God's grace and mercy on display? We always want to look for that, especially in the Old Testament. Where is God's grace and mercy already showing up, even though Jesus hasn't come onto the scene yet? All right, so that takes us to the end of this lecture. Think about those things as you read, and just if you're in my class, take a look at the discussion questions as well, because that will kind of help guide you as you do the readings in Exodus. Thank you very much.